Hey guys, this is Mr. Fordham, and this is your final milestone review PowerPoint. This is probably the most important review video that we have, so make sure that you watch this one. If you're crashing the night before the milestone, I'd watch this video. So make sure your buddies look at it and everything else. Don't forget to take the quiz that goes along with it as well. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly, but if you need to go back and look, I've got it posted somewhere you can get to it, all right? Or you can email me and I'll email it to you as well. All right, so the first thing we talked about early in the semester was triangular trade and the Columbian Exchange. Guys, why do we call it Columbian Exchange? Who's it named after?
Christopher Columbus.
Christopher Columbus. He didn't know that's what he was starting, but he did start it. And what year did he start it by accident?
1942.
Oh, almost.
1492.
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, okay? So he starts it, and the Columbian Exchange is, you know, the different things that come back and forth between the New World and the Old World, the raw materials that come from here and the finished products that will come from here, and it's an exchange back and forth. Now on the milestone, sometimes you'll see just like, for example, let's see if it'll let me write on it. Yep, you'll see a circle that'll say North America or something like that. Then you'll see another circle that says Europe or something like that, or New World and Old World, and you'll see an arrow like that and an arrow like that, one saying raw materials and one saying finished products or finished goods or something like that. That is clearly a really easy representation of the Columbian Exchange, okay? The big difference between the Columbian Exchange and what we call triangular trade is what, right here?
The Middle Passage.
The Middle Passage, on which carried what?
Slaves.
Slaves from Africa to the New World. So in general, the Columbian Exchange sort of kind of leaves slavery out of the picture. But beyond that, you know the way this works. We have to have these new colonies. It's mercantilism, remember that the Old World, they want the colonies because they don't have unlimited resources. England, for example, what kind of landform are they? They're a what?
Island.
An island. So they definitely have limited resources. That's why they wanted 13 different colonies over here, or got them over time, because they could have all kinds of different resources. If you're going to have an empire, you need colonies, all right? So that's what they do here, and that's why the raw materials come from the New World back to the Old World, where they have the manufacturing capabilities, the factories, and they will produce the textiles and that sort of thing over here. Now, some of the raw materials, don't forget, you're going to get tobacco over here. Remember 1607, what do we found?
Jamestown.
Jamestown. Tobacco saves the place. Don't forget that. Tobacco is a big deal. Don't forget about the sugar cane. What do they make out of sugar cane?
Sugar, syrup, rum.
Sugar, syrup, rum. Rum's the big one, right? Cotton, they take the cotton and they make it into clothes, right? So those are all the raw materials, and then the finished products go out from there. They also serve as a market for them to send that back to, all right? But the Middle Passage, don't forget, that is where the slaves come to the New World. Now let's talk about the Great Awakening. That's a big deal. What is getting awakened in the Great Awakening?
The people.
The people about what specifically?
I would say religion.
Religion. Okay, so we went from people who were very religious, like the Puritans, to people kind of being burnt out. Remember the halfway covenant?
I believe so.
Yeah, remember the halfway covenant. So you've got people who say, my grandparents were members of the church, or my parents were members of the church, but I don't really care to be in the church. They're too strict, right? So the church, what happens to people over time in the church? The old people start to what? Die. So the congregations are getting smaller and smaller, and they said, well, what can we do? Well, they reach out to the kids of the people that aren't coming, and they say, all right, well, you guys can come to church. I mean, you're not going to heaven, but you can still participate in, giving your tithes and that sort of thing. Well, how nice of them, right? You can be half members. I mean, we don't believe you're going to heaven, but you can still pay your tithes. What was all that about?
Money.
And people were frustrated with that. So we went from really, really religious people who came to America, particularly in New England, Rhode Island, Roger Williams, all those folks, right? Now they're burnt out on it. So what we have now is a great awakening after they've been burnt out because of the Salem witch trials and the halfway covenant and stuff like that. Now they're back into religion. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so ministers were saying that the people would feel God's love only if they admitted their sins. They needed them to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And there's this emphasis on individual conversion. So you are converted individually to Christianity. It has nothing to do with your ties to the church. It's about an individual relationship with God. They emphasized that. Ministers attracted enormous crowds, and they would often travel from colony to colony. Christianity grew, although established churches lose members, because this new way of worship, it's more personal. It's less about church membership, and it's more about personal relationship, personal Bible study, and that sort of thing. Some preachers said American society had become as corrupt as English society. As a result, some people started saying that America needed to cut its ties with Britain to keep the religion pure. Thus, these ministers were arguing early on for what?
American Revolution.
American Revolution. They didn't mean to. They were just saying, they weren't talking about freedom and all that. They were just talking about how corrupt England was. We got to break away from these guys. So a lot of the people who were arguing early on to split from England were actually the preachers. All right, here's some of our key amendments that have popped up in years past. Make sure you know the 16th Amendment is what?
Income tax.
Establishes the income tax. That's the one you hate the most when you get your paycheck. The 17th Amendment is one of our progressive amendments, and it establishes what?
Direct election of senators.
Yeah, so as before, your local state legislature would pick the senators. Now you get to pick your senators. You get to vote for them directly. Now we've got our Reconstruction amendments. We already kind of talked about those in a previous video, but the 13th through the 15th. So the 13th does what?
Freedom.
Gives them freedom. 14th
Citizenship.
and 15th.
Votes.
And what's the key part of the 14th Amendment?
Votes to black males.
No, that's 15th. Or what did I say?
Oh,
The
14.
equal protection.
Equal Protection Clause is part of the 14th Amendment. Don't forget that. That's so important. So we remember that freedom, citizenship, and votes. And then don't forget the 14th, the Equal Protection Clause is used to argue for civil rights, all right? The 18th is,
Prohibition.
what's the T word that often goes with prohibition?
Temperance.
Temperance. Don't miss that one. The 19th is,
Women's suffrage.
okay, so one woman suffers for 9 months, 19 suffers suffrage, voting. Put all that together. That's the way you can remember that. 21st does what?
Ends prohibition.
Ends prohibition. We remember that.
18 to party, 21 to drink.
18 to party, 21 to drink. 18th Amendment, you can show up to the party, but you can't drink. 21st Amendment, you can drink. It gets rid of the 18th Amendment. It repeals it, all right? The 22nd Amendment limits the president to
2 terms.
And I remember 2 equals
Two terms.
very good. Salutary neglect. This word pops up very often, and we forgot what it means from early on in American history. Before the British needed money because of their expenses in the French and Indian War, Britain largely let the colonies do what they wanted. They got away with a lot. Think of the speed limit. It's very lenient, right? If the interstate speed limit is 70 and you go 71, are you going to get pulled over?
No.
Probably not, right? It's very lenient with that regard. But if you go much more than that, if you're going 90, you're going to get pulled over. If that's pretty much salutary neglect. But if all of a sudden they cracked the whip and started, if you go 70.5 over, right? Even a little bit, and all of a sudden they start pulling you over, that's going to be called what? Parliamentary sovereignty. So it's basically they're cracking the whip, all right? And that's pretty much what the British did to the colonies. Before they were allowed to have their own assemblies and pretty well do whatever they wanted to, now they're cracking the whip. Okay, they need the money, right? They're going to make them pay up like they're supposed to. So after the French and Indian War, the British needed money, so they were more strict on the colonies. That's parliamentary sovereignty. So don't forget salutary neglect. They're kind of neglecting them, letting them do what they want. Parliamentary sovereignty, they're cracking the whip because they need the what?
Money.
It's all about the money. All right, the menacing shadow. This is a very important Political cartoon. And what is this one representing? The donkey.
Democrats.
The Democrats, because the donkey is representative of the Democratic Party. Now it says absolute political control of our courts. What's it talking about?
Court packing.
Court packing. Do you remember what court packing was? Anybody?
Didn't he raise the number of senators?
Not
Or
senators, but justices.
Justices.
On the Supreme Court. It was 9. He wanted to up it to 13. Why would he do that?
So he could have more of his friends in the court.
Yeah, people who agreed with him and would side on New Deal issues. And we say him, we're talking about who?
FDR.
FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the New Deal, there were certain things that he was trying to do that the Supreme Court said, that's unconstitutional, can't do it. He says, well, I'll fix you. I'll up the amount of people on the Supreme Court, and they'll agree with me because they'll be my picks, right? They said, nope, you can't do that. Okay, so that was, they saw him as trying to be a bit of a dictator doing something like that, but it fell apart, it didn't work, and that's what the menacing shadow is all about. So don't forget about this one, it's very important, okay? All right, now we talk about, when we do the first 9 weeks review poster, we talk about the different battles in the American Revolution. How do we remember those, by the way, real quick?
Ladies can't see you.
Ladies can't see you. What's LC?
Lexington and Concord.
Lexington and Concord, shots heard around the world. S?
Saratoga.
Saratoga, which was
Turning
the
point.
turning point. And then,
Yorktown.
Battle of Yorktown. It's the last one. It's where we end the American Revolution. And who?
Cornwallis.
Cornwallis surrenders. And we finally are finished with that thing, okay? All right, the political parties. Now, a word you might not be as familiar with is factions, okay? When you're broken into factions, you're broken into opposing viewpoints, opposing sides. That's all political parties are. And they run candidates for political office. That's what a political party is. The U.S. has had many political parties over the years. Our earliest ones, as you remember, were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Then we had the Democratic Republicans that were started by Thomas Jefferson. We had the Whigs, right? They weren't that successful, but they were around for a little while. Now our top 2 are what?
Democrats and
Democrats and Republicans. We've also got the Green Party, the Libertarian Party. We got a few more, but those are what we call third parties. They're
We've
not
had
that
the Bull
important.
Moose Party.
What's that?
The Bull Moose Party.
The Bull Moose Party was around. That was the progressive party that Teddy had started for a little while, right? So these are our main 2 today. The Democrats tend to be more what?
Liberal.
Liberal, they're progressive, and the Republicans tend to be more conservative. So liberals want to spend more money and have more programs to help people. Republicans are more conservative, and they want to have less taxes, and they want to spend less money, and they want the economy to kind of fix itself. So it's 2 opposing views that kind of go back and forth. Think with Republicans and conservative, think Reaganomics, okay? Cutting at the top and it trickle down to everybody else, trickle down economics, okay? So those are the 2 opposing viewpoints. I was trying to think if there was anything else we need to talk about, but don't forget the Federalists wanted to go ahead and have the Constitution win. Have it ratified when?
Right away.
Right away. Now, the Anti-Federalists said not until you give us a what?
Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights, and that was pushed by Thomas Jefferson as well, okay? Who was it who told us not to have political parties?
George Washington.
George Washington. We didn't listen to him, right? He also told us what? Don't get involved in foreign affairs. Very good. All right, economic disparity. This is a Civil War term. Before the Civil War, agriculture was in the South versus industry in the North. This caused tension between the 2 because it's 2 completely different lifestyles. In the North, they've got factories, so they don't need what? Slaves, okay? In the South, you've got a different idea. Now, sometimes what you'll see with these types of questions is you'll see pie charts, right? And we've looked at some, but you'll see a pie chart here and a pie chart there, and it'll show, it'll show that the North has all the population. The whole thing's filled in but a little bit, okay? And the South has the little bit of population, right? So they've got all the population. The North also had all the what?
Manufacturing goods.
Manufactured goods. You might see another one looks like this. They had all the railroads, right? What's the one thing the South had
Slaves.
well, slaves, yeah, but what else?
Cotton.
Cotton. We had the majority, I say we, the South had the majority of the exports.
And we had the
Okay.
raw materials.
What's that?
The South had the raw materials.
The raw materials, that's absolutely right. And the North is going to have pretty much everything else. They're going to have the railroads, they're going to have the population, they're going to have the manufactured goods, okay? So there's an economic disparity. There's a disparity between the North and the South, okay? The South feels like it's getting taken for a ride, just like the colonies felt like the English were taking them for a ride in their mercantilism, right? So when they tried to pass some tariffs and things like that, the South feels very offended about it. And on the side note, you've also got the morality of slavery question, right? And you've got several other factors, states' rights, Uncle Tom's Cabin, westward expansion, and all the other things that go along with this. But don't forget economic disparity, which is industry versus agriculture. That's a big deal, all right? Civil War generals, don't forget General Lee is for the South. He's going to be in what color?
Gray.
Gray. And then General Ulysses S. Grant is for the North. He's going to be wearing
Blue.
blue, okay? Who's one of Lee's helpers?
Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson. Who's one of his helpers? Grant's helpers.
I wouldn't say Cornwallis, would I?
No. That's American Revolution. Think about who burnt down Georgia.
Sherman.
Sherman's March to the Sea. Don't forget about that guy, okay? Who was the president of the United States during that time? 1860?
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln. Who's the president of the Confederate States?
Jefferson Davis.
Jefferson Davis, okay? Don't forget these folks. All right, Daniel Shays Rebellion. Backing up a little bit in time here. What is the most important thing about Shays Rebellion?
It proves that the Articles of Confederations were weak.
It proves that the Articles of Confederation is weak, and therefore we need a new Constitution. So it was led by Daniel Shays. He led more than 1,000 farmers who, like him, were burdened with personal debt that they couldn't repay. And a lot of it stemmed from the state's Revolutionary War debts. So Shays and his men went to seize a federal arsenal in Massachusetts, but the government under the Articles of Confederation had no power to tax. Had a weak government. They couldn't repair the national economy. They weren't even supposed to do certain things with regard to calling up an army. So George Washington, who wasn't the president yet, he's not the president until we have the new Constitution, but he was still the guy we looked to, right? He went and put this thing down and established a stronger central government, okay? That's what we need to do after he puts this thing down. So here's the most important part in red. It showed that the Articles of Confederation was too weak and that we needed a new constitution. That's Shays' Rebellion. Got me? Okay, let's talk about Jacksonian democracy. Make sure you know that term. Basically, what's going on under President Andrew Jackson. He's the hero of War of 1812. He beats the British at New Orleans, even though the war was already over. But he was also cheated out of the election of 1824 with a compromise that had been come up by who?
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay, because Henry Clay
saves
the day. And this is one of the worst things Henry Clay did. But basically, this election was really close, so it got thrown into the House of Representatives. Henry Clay works it out to where Jackson, even though he got the popular vote, doesn't win. Who wins this one? His daddy had been president. His daddy had been the second president. John
Adams.
Quincy Adams, okay? John Adams had been second president, remember, because he was George Washington's vice president. John Quincy Adams becomes president instead of Andrew Jackson. So pretty much that election of 1824 was stolen from him. People who loved him called him Old Hickory. People who hated him called him King Andrew, okay? Because he did what he wanted to do. He kind of ruled, some people said, like a dictator with certain things that he did, like killing the National Bank. He also did the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. You know about that one. And the part of Jacksonian democracy is the spoils system. What's the spoils system?
Where they the person that's above them, friends, you giving your friends more more opportunities than other regular people.
Absolutely. So you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. When I become president, I'll give you a job, right? That's exactly what this is. You appoint your supporters to office, the spoil system, and of course nobody would do that now, would they? Of course, they all do that, right? All right, the nullification crisis, so important. Basically, he fights with his own vice president, John C. Calhoun. One of the war hawks, John C. Calhoun from the Senate, became his vice president. John C. Calhoun was from the state of South Carolina, and that's where the nullification crisis came from. There was a tariff that they were supposed to be enforcing in South Carolina, and Jackson wanted it enforced, even if they didn't like it. Well, the tariff was hurting the industry of South Carolina, so they said, we're not going to enforce it. If there's a law we don't like, we'll just nullify it. That means we're not going to follow it. It's considered null and void. Well, can a state just say, I don't like a federal law and not follow it? No, and that was decided with the nullification crisis. Well, Vice President John C. Calhoun penned an op-ed about it, and he tried to be anonymous, but Jackson found out about it, and he basically threatened Calhoun. Calhoun resigns as vice president. He goes back to South Carolina. Jackson also sent the military down to Charleston Harbor and said, I'll consider it an act of war if you don't start doing what you're supposed to do. So really what he does is he avoids the Civil War for just a short period of time, okay? He hated the national bank idea, and the charter was up for the Bank of the United States, so they tried to recharter it, and he vetoed it. So he killed the Bank of the United States, which would have functioned something like the Fed does today, controlling the money supply and stuff like that. He didn't like that. He was our first populist president. What that means is they liked him, not necessarily his policies so much, right? They voted for him because they liked him.
He was a common man.
He was a common dude. He was a war hero. They liked him. He appealed to the common man. And also, he gave all white men the right to vote, not just landowners. So he expanded voting rights. Does that make sense? So even more people liked him. It was really just a cult of personality, okay? So that's what Jacksonian democracy is really all about. All right, John Brown. Here's some important things about John Brown. There's a good picture of him, and this is a very popular picture of him. I got it on the wall somewhere. He attempted a slave rebellion with his sons at the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Who was the guy who put that down, by the way? He was a captain in the Army back then. He worked for the United States. You later know him as General Lee. Robert E. Lee. He was the captain who went and put this thing down. And so he gets to the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. What does he want to do? What's his goal?
Start a slave rebellion.
Start a slave rebellion. Guess how many slaves showed up?
None.
It was just him and his son, so this wasn't much of a fight at all. It was unsuccessful, and he gets executed for this. Here's the important part. It causes further sectionalism. When you see this word sectionalism, it's one of our tissues plus W, right? It's one of our causes of the Civil War. Sectionalism is, I am all about my section of the United States. I'm a Georgian before I'm an American. I'm a Southerner before I'm an American, right? And then you got the people up north. Well, they hate the people up north. You know, they called them Yankees. They didn't like them. Okay, so this makes it even worse. This causes even more tension because up north, if you heard about what John Brown was doing, what did you think about him?
He was a hero.
You thought he was a hero. In the South, what do they think?
Thought he was crazy.
He's a traitor. So this causes even more tension, right? All right, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was passed by Congress May 30th, 1854, and it allowed people in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves to vote whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. This act served to repeal the Missouri Compromise. What was the line that the Missouri Compromise established? 36, 30. You're right, 3630. So no slavery above the 3630 or below, with the exception of Missouri, because it was sticking out above it. But this, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. And I know we hadn't talked about that in a while, right? But it repeals it, and this had prohibited slavery above that line of latitude. That's how I remember it. Latitude is like this, longitude is like this. I say latitude, flatitude. So that's what that thing did. What's it called when you get to, as a state, vote as to whether or not you're going to have slavery?
Popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty. Very good. Don't forget about that. All right. The election of 1876 ends Reconstruction. Okay. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, becomes president in exchange for removing troops from the South. Again, this is a really close race, and Tilden is the Democrat. Basically, they cut Rutherford B. Hayes a deal. They said, we will give you the election if you get these troops out of the South. Remember, the South was in military districts in Reconstruction. It wasn't states anymore. He ends Reconstruction. That means he ends it in 1877, because he was elected in 76 in November, takes office that next year in 77. You got me? So this is really what we call a compromise of 1877. That's a big deal there, okay? All right, the Great Migration. After the Civil War, many blacks moved from the South to the North looking for work. They were going to big cities like St. Louis, Missouri, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Baltimore. Why are they leaving the South after the Civil War?
They don't want to be stuck there anymore.
They don't want to be stuck down here because many of them were still working on the same land as their former owners, or of their parents' former owners. So now the kids of these guys want to move up north and get some new jobs and that sort of thing. So there's a big movement of African Americans, former slaves, and also the children of former slaves as they're moving up north. So if you see a map like this with all these folks moving up north and you see these lines pointing up, that's what it's about. It's the Great Migration, okay? Progressivism. Sorry, it's after school, it happens. Progressivism, okay? Don't forget about the progressives. There's a whole poster review about that one. But progressives were basically who? People who wanted to do what?
Make the world a better place.
Make the world a better place, but mainly through what?
Journalism.
Journalism, laws, they want more government control and things like that, right? And some of it's good. Some people don't like some of it, but some people do like some of it. But the journalists who were for this were called muckrakers, okay? And why do they call them muckrakers?
Because of...
They were getting rid of political muck.
Yeah, political muck, the nastiness, right? Remember that video from the America, the Story of Us, where the guy's cleaning up down those nasty...
With the white suits.
Yeah, with the white suits, cleaning up down the nasty alleyways and all of that sort of thing. They're raking up the muck, right? She wrote The History of Standard Oil, and the muck she was going after was who?
John D. Rockefeller.
John D. Rockefeller and his monopolist or trust cutthroat tactics in business, all right? So that's Ida Tarbell. How did I tell you to remember Ida Tarbell with John D. Rockefeller?
Tar and oil.
Tar, right? Tar and oil kind of relate in some way. So that's how I put that together. Some of the other guys were Jacob Rees. Remember, he's the photographer, How the Other Half Lives. Upton Sinclair, what did he write?
The Jungle.
The Jungle, and he was going after the what?
The food packing industry.
Yeah, meat packing industry specifically. And he was actually trying to help who?
The people.
The people. He said, he looked at these poor immigrants and the way they're treated, but everybody didn't see that. What did they see?
The nasty.
Ugh, like it. He said, I aimed for their heart and I hit them in the stomach by accident, right? All right. Okay, Progressivism, Muckraking Magazine, McClure's Magazine. McClure's Magazine is one of the major progressive publications of the time. Make sure you know that. That has popped up before. McClure's Magazine, Progressivism, main magazine in the early 1900s. And this is actually, they were publishing something about John D. Rockefeller right here in McClure's Magazine in this picture. Okay, so it's a muckraking magazine in the early 1900s. All right, containment versus appeasement. The goal of containment is to keep communism where it currently exists and not allow it to spread to other countries. So I want you, when you think about containment, think about a container, right? Like Tupperware. The purpose of that Tupperware is to keep my food from what?
Spoiling.
From spoiling, but also from going all over the place, right? I keep it in that one area. It doesn't go anywhere. If I've got a container full of banana pudding, you know, I can leave it there and it's going to stay in its container. But if I remove it from the container, it's going to what? go everywhere. So the point of containment is to keep things where it is. It's not going to get rid of it, but it's going to keep it where it is. The goal of appeasement is to give in to an adversary in order to avoid conflict. Neville Chamberlain, who was the guy in charge of England, the prime minister at the time of World War II, right before it, he gave in to Hitler. He appeased him. He was appeasing a bully. Do you remember talking about that? The giving in to Adolf Hitler, all right? What happens when you give in to a bully?
They keep doing
They
it.
keep on doing it. Winston Churchill came in and switched that around and said, we're not going to do that anymore, okay? All right, the Monroe Doctrine. European countries have to what?
Stay out of our
Stay out of our hemisphere. This is our area. So if you see something like this, the Monroe Doctrine, there's a big fence here, and we're saying to Europe, stay out of here. North America, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, this is our hemisphere, our territory. Stay out. Got it? That's the Monroe Doctrine. Manifest destiny means we what?
Own from sea to
Own
shining
from sea to shining sea. It's this belief that from God, we're supposed to own from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Capiche? When you see this picture, this is manifest destiny. It's seemingly Lady Liberty flying like an angel out west, right? And what else do you see in the picture?
telegram.
You see the telegraph, that's going out west. What's she holding in her hand there? Not a Bible.
The bill of no.
It says public schools on it. I know you can't see it, that's why I'm telling you. But it's a public school book because we're sending public schools out west as well. By the way, the Articles of Confederation was also valuable because it gave us a way to add new what? We talked about this earlier. New states and public education as we go out west. But she does that as well in this picture. We're taking that out west. Also what?
Those are trains.
Trains. We got people in covered wagons moving out that way. But all the while, who's running to get away?
Indians.
The Indians and
The buffalo.
the buffalo, okay? That's manifest destiny. That is from God. God wants us to own all that land from sea to shining sea. All right, key presidents. We're supposed to know about Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. He commanded the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War in Cuba. They won a big battle at San Juan Hill. Don't forget about that. He had been vice president to William McKinley. He was the 33rd governor of New York. He was a progressive. He was a progressive president. He was a trust buster. He went after the big trusts, the monopolies. He was a conservationist. He wanted to conserve, right? And which meant his national parks. By the way, we'll get down to it. He also constructed the Panama Canal, and his foreign policy could best be described with this: speak softly and carry a big what? Stick. In other words, we will deal with you diplomatically, but if we have to, we'll use what?
Force.
Force, our military. Good. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is something he established. Corollary means what?
Stay out and we will.
But what does the word corollary mean?
It's like changing something.
Well, it's not quite a change, but
Add.
add to. It's like an amendment, okay? Monroe Doctrine told Europe to what?
Stay out.
Stay out. The corollary added what part to it?
And we'll
Anyone who's acting up in our hemisphere, we have the right to go in and say something about
Absolutely. We are the sheriff in town. Not only do you guys have to stay out, down to everybody that is here, you better behave or we'll step in. Okay? We're the sheriff. All right? The square deal. He presents us with the square deal. FDR is the what?
no.
it. New Deal.
New Deal. FDR is the New Deal. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, is the Great Society. Remember those three big things? Don't forget that. You might want to write it down if you didn't know it. We've got, under Teddy, we've got the Square Deal. Under FDR, we've got the New Deal. And under LBJ, we've got the Great Society, which is mostly Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid is for who?
Old people.
Or poor people.
Poor
Medicaid.
people. Medicare is for
Old people.
old people, okay? And then with FDR, he has his what? Triple
R's.
R's, which are
Reform.
reform,
Recover.
recovery, and relief. Relief, recovery, reform. Who gets relief?
The people.
The people. What's got to recover?
Economy.
The economy, and what's got to reform?
government.
The government, so that this never happens
again.
again. Now, this happens before all this. Teddy has his 3 C's, which are part of his square deal. He said Americans deserve a square deal, right? And they are conservation
consumers,
and corporate greed. So he wants conservation, which is, conserving natural resources like national parks. What are some of our national parks? Yosemite and Yellowstone. Very good. He established those, okay? Consumers, he wants to protect you and me. Consumers, he wants to go after corporate greed. That includes busting up some of the trusts, okay? All right. And he actually, for a time, becomes a bull moose. He establishes the Progressive Party, okay? So if you look at some of these pictures, all of these represent Teddy. You can tell the difference between Teddy and FDR. He's got his glasses and his stash, right? You see right here, this is him walking around the Caribbean, pulling his toy boat. He's carrying his big stick, right? He says, "I rule this area." This is Roosevelt Corollary and Speak Softly and Carry a Big Stick. This is him walking around like the sheriff, carrying his big stick, right? And this one right here, this is him telling Europe, stay out of this region. This is our region. Make sense? So don't forget these. Sometimes these pop up as these political cartoons with reference to Teddy. FDR, another important one. He beat Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression. That's why they blamed Herbert Hoover for not acting enough. That's why they called them Hoovervilles. During the New Deal, he created lots of agencies like the TVA. What was the TVA for?
Tennessee
Valley Authority.
Yes.
But it was for electricity, remember? To get cheap electricity to the South. The CCC, that was Civilian Conservation Corps. That was for young men, remember? Remember all that stuff? The WPA, Works Progress Administration, that was for everybody else, and that paid people to be artists and actors and downtown projects and stuff like that. That was all part of his New Deal. Created lots of agencies to help with the economy. His triple R's, again, were what? Relief,
recovery, and
reform. He also tried court packing when he didn't get his way. That didn't work out, remember? He was the 44th governor of New York. He was president during World War II. He opposed prohibition. He thought that was a bad idea. He died in office from polio, and he was actually at Warm Springs, Georgia when that happened. He was in a wheelchair. These are some important things he said. During his election, he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, which incidentally, today's December 7th when we're doing this review. This is Pearl Harbor Day. He said December 7th was a
day which
will live in infamy. If you're famous for something, you're known for something good. If you're infamous for something, you're known for something bad. So a day which will live in infamy. And there he is. Who was his wife, by the way? Remember? Eleanor Roosevelt. She did a lot of work for women's rights as well. Harry Truman, don't forget about him. He was FDR's vice president. He took over when FDR died. FDR is one of our only presidents to be elected to a third term. Okay, this was back before the 22nd Amendment. He's kind of why we got the 22nd Amendment, so you could only serve 2 terms. And FDR dies in office during that time. Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He implemented the Marshall Plan. Remember, Marshall starts with M and money starts with M, and that's to rebuild Europe. We're paying them not to become communist, right? He implemented the Truman Doctrine. Don't forget this. This is a little bit different from Monroe Doctrine. Okay, Monroe Doctrine tells them to stay out. Truman Doctrine says we will defend anybody that communism threatens. Okay, very good. That's Harry Truman. And what else did Harry Truman did? He integrated the military. Don't forget that. You might want to jot that down. I should have put that on here. He integrates the military. Okay, that's one of the first big movements in the 50s for civil rights. Key presidents, JFK. He's the youngest president ever elected at 43 years old. Okay? He had the South Vietnamese president Diem assassinated, which was kind of controversial because he was our friend, we thought, but he was very corrupt. He also got NASA going in the space race, which is under that big umbrella of the Cold War, right? And he made the statement, we choose to go to the moon by the end of this century. He ordered the Bay of Pigs. Don't forget that invasion where we took the Cuban nationals, trained them, and had them invade Cuba. He dealt with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the standoff between Khrushchev and Soviet Union and us. He made this very important quote: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." He beat Richard Nixon in the 1960 election, and this was the first on-air TV debate. Don't forget that, okay? That was one reason that he won, because he looked so good on TV. His younger brother, Robert or Bobby Kennedy, RFK, was Attorney General and was also assassinated in 1968 while running for president, because 1968 was the worst year ever. MLK was also assassinated that year. The Tet Offensive was that year. The Democratic National Convention riots were that year. And Nixon got elected as a result of that. LBJ, JFK's vice president. He took over when JFK was assassinated. He was from Texas, okay? He was in the Senate. He knew how to get things done. He tried to end the Vietnam War but failed. He was the subject of protest. He was elected one time on his own right, 1964, but decides not to run again in 1968, which is why the Democratic Convention was such a disaster. They didn't have LBJ. RFK had been killed, so that's one reason it was a disaster. He had his Great Society. He signed the civil... Now, don't forget the Great Society is two parts. What? Medicaid and Medicare. Medicare is for
old people.
Medicaid is for
poor.
I remember I care for grandma. That's why I remember old people. He spent money on the arts, and don't forget this term. I haven't mentioned it in class, but you got to know it. The war on poverty. Okay? He wants to go to war on poverty. That's his Great Society. That's his version of the New Deal. All right? He was so depressed by Vietnam, he decides not to run again in 1968. He had been a senator from Texas. That's LBJ, okay? Also, don't forget he signs the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, okay? Why do we need a Civil Rights Act? We already had Board of Education, Brown versus Board. Why do we need a Civil Rights Act? What did Brown desegregate? Schools, but it didn't desegregate
everything else.
So that's why we needed the Civil Rights Act. What about the Voting Rights Act?
So everyone could vote.
So everyone could vote. That got rid of all that nonsense, right? Okay. Key presidents: Nixon. He had been Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president. He runs for president in 1960 but loses to JFK. He won by a landslide both times. He opened relations with China. Don't forget this French word, détente, foreign policy. He wanted to ease tensions between the communists and us, that is USSR and China. He ended Vietnam War. He wanted to do peace with honor. Okay, and he called it Vietnamization, which is a gradual thing. As we pull our troops out, we replace them with their troops. He was forced to resign over the Watergate scandal, and Gerald Ford pardoned him. Don't forget, did he break into the Watergate place?
No.
He tried to cover
No, but he tried to cover it up, okay? Don't forget, that was Richard Nixon. Key presidents: Jimmy Carter from Georgia. His most important thing were the Camp David Accords. He attempted peace between Israel and Egypt, and it worked, okay? That's the Camp David Accords. There was a horrible recession during his presidency. He worked to help other countries with human rights. He had to deal with the Iran hostage crisis, though. 52 American hostages from our embassy were held for 444 days. When did they let them go? The day that Reagan took office, they let them go. He had been governor of Georgia, and he gave the Panama Canal back to Panama, and he's been known for promoting human rights ever since, okay? But don't forget, his most important thing, good thing, is Camp David Accords. His most important bad thing was the Iranian hostage situation. That's Jimmy Carter from Georgia. All right, don't forget, Reagan had a whole lot of things, like we're skipping him and George H.W. Bush, but remember they had Reaganomics and all that sort of thing. Bill Clinton, he had been governor of Arkansas, husband of Hillary Clinton, who was the first woman to be nominated for president by a major party, the Democrats. He worked with the Congress for a contract with America, with Newt Gingrich. So their relationship was very tense in the 90s, but he did get some stuff done. He balanced the budget for the first time since Andrew Jackson, the longest period of economic expansion in American history. He did some military intervention of his own in Bosnia and Kosovo and Somalia. Very important because President Trump has been getting rid of NAFTA. He signs NAFTA into force. Don't get NAFTA confused with NATO. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? It's between what three countries?
Canada, the USA, and Mexico.
Mexico. It opens up borders, but it also make things a little bit harsh for local people. Okay, he does NAFTA. What's NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is our what we do. It's a military alliance. Okay, so don't get those two mixed up. Only after the second president to get impeached. Now, does impeached mean get kicked out of office?
No.
No, he was just put on trial. Then they acquitted him. Okay, the scandal from the Monica Lewinsky thing. The Senate acquitted him. In other words, they pretty much said there's not enough evidence to convict you. You are pretty much innocent. So don't forget that word acquit. They acquitted him, all right? Who was the other president to get impeached?
Nixon.
No, Nixon resigned. He would have gotten impeached, but
Johnson.
Andrew Johnson. He was the guy who took over after Lincoln, and his own party didn't like him very much because he was from Tennessee and had been a slave owner, all right? All right, World War I to World War II, really quick. World War I, the good guys were the
Allies.
or the
Allied powers.
and the U.S. joins after the
Lusitania.
is sunk. We call this
Unrestricted submarine warfare.
unrestricted submarine warfare. The bad guys were called the
Central Powers.
all right, and they were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. World War II, the good guys were still the
Allies.
or the
Allied powers.
all right. The U.S. joins after
Pearl Harbor.
On
December 7th.
1941, and FDR called it a
Day which will live in infamy.
okay. The bad guys were called the
Axis powers.
don't forget. So Central Powers World War I, Axis Powers World War II are the bad guys, and it was Germany run by
Hitler.
and the
Nazis.
also Italy run by,
Mussolini.
and he had
Fascism.
and Japan, which was run by.
Tojo.
He had Hideki Tojo as the military commander, who is the emperor. Hirohito. Don't forget that. The Soviet Union switches to the good guys after.
Hitler stabbed Stalin in the back.
Good. He invaded the Soviet Union. He stabbed him in the back. Stalin believes in,
Communism.
which is basically no.
Private property.
We also had D-Day, which was the invasion at.
Normandy.
Okay, and that was in France, right? Then we have VE Day, which is
The victory in Europe.
victory in Europe. Who surrendered for us to have that?
Germany.
Germany. Then we had VJ Day, which is
Victory in Japan.
okay, and don't forget the picture. You might want to zoom in on that real quick. Don't forget the guy kissing the woman. That means the war is officially over after VJ Day. Okay. There's also a lot of propaganda during that time, specifically.
Rosie the Riveter.
Show Rosie real quick. Don't forget Rosie. She got the women out working, okay? Taking their men's jobs while they were gone fighting. Miranda versus Arizona. I already went over that in a poster thing, but don't forget, cops have to read you your rights when they arrest you. From that moment, you have to know what your rights are. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say or do, yada, 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 right? You have the right to an attorney, so on and so forth. If you can't afford one, they'll give you one. Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy said,
Yes,
Yes,
to
to
segregation.
which is a bad thing, right? Segregation is bad. You're separated. What's the other two words that are against segregation? Desegregation, and
Integration.
integration. Those are the opposite of segregation. So Plessy said yes to segregation, but then
Brown struck it down.
Brown strikes it down. Brown versus Board of Education. Don't forget little Linda Brown. And she's able to go to the school that she wants to go to after Brown, okay? Who was the leader of that trial?
Thurgood Marshall.
Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. He becomes famous for that, and then he becomes the first what?
Justice in the
Was
or
it
black
first-
justice.
First black justice on the Supreme Court.
They
Very
used the
good.
Fourth Amendment.
And do what now?
They used the 14th.
They used the 14th Amendment. Thank you. Don't forget that. Great Depression till 1939, okay? That was called Black Tuesday, okay? Stock market crashes. Is that a cause of the Great Depression?
It's a symptom.
It's a symptom that something was wrong. Here's the causes. Read them with me. Overproduction, underconsumption, buying on margin, or
Speculation.
credit, and the...
Dust Bowl.
Don't forget that. What is buying on margin or speculation?
Credit.
Production, no.
Basically, you borrow money in order to buy what?
A stocks.
Stocks on the stock market. You can't do that. That's illegal now, okay? Because what happens when it crashes? They can't what?
Get their money back.
They can't get their money back. That's why a lot of them are committing suicide, okay? 1968 is the
Worst
year
year
ever. Worst year ever. The assassination of RFK, Robert F. Kennedy. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The Tet Offensive was that year. That's where the North Vietnamese were attacking the South. Tons of attacks, all in a short period of time, all along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Okay, and it hurt us very bad. The Democratic Convention riots in Chicago, and as a result, Nixon is elected. All right, he promised to end Vietnam, and he eventually resigns because of the Watergate cover-up. Again, just the cover-up part. Social media and politics. Don't forget, social media such as Twitter and Facebook have become a major factor in elections. Candidates reach their constituents by bypassing the media. They don't have to go through newspapers and cable news. They can go right to their people on Twitter. That's a brand new development. Donald Trump has done that a lot with Twitter, and it's a free way to run for election. You don't have to pay any money. If you got a big following on Twitter, you can communicate with your people directly, right? So social media and politics is a big new development. Guys, this is all I have. This is probably, as I said, this is the biggest deal right here, this PowerPoint. If I was going to study and watch some videos over and over, I'd watch this one, okay? Don't forget to take the quiz. Good luck. You can do it.